Welcome to another episode of our Mexico City edition of My Surrogacy Journey, the podcast. How are you doing? So I'm Michael, one of the co-founders at My Surrogacy Journey. I'm a dad through UK surrogacy to two gorgeous children.
I'm Wes, the other co-founder of My Surrogacy Journey and the other half of Michael. When we created our organisation back in 2021, we wanted to challenge the surrogacy landscape and create an organisation which was a little bit different, and I think done that.
We have. Now, if you're watching this particular podcast episode, you will be able to see behind me that we are coming to you today from Mexico City. So we're in our office location in Polanco, and this is all part of this new Mexico City edition.
We've got some great guests and we're going to introduce them in a second, but We're really looking forward to busting some myths and introducing you to some of our partners and our teams, and hopefully getting the answers to all things surrogacy that you're looking for.
So the Mexico City pathway was launched in 2023, and we have improved that in January 2024 with the opening of our office here in Polanco. So since then, the pathway has been super popular and has been much needed support for people. And we're going to be talking to two special guests today that you may already know or may have interacted with previously on our socials.
But before I introduce them, let me tell you about what this episode is about today.
Yes, tell us.
We are talking all about everything embryo export. So if you have embryos primarily in the UK and you need to move them to Mexico City, everything you need to know about that is going to be discussed on this today. So let's introduce our two amazing guests. So let me look at the sheet so I get it right. So we're talking to, who's a regular on our podcast, is Debbie Evans, who is our Clinical and Compliance Director for My Surrogacy Journey. Hi, Debbie.
Hi, boys.
How are you?
Nice to be here in beautiful Mexico City.
I know.
It's a bit hot, isn't it?
And the sun behind us.
I know.
Gorgeous, gorgeous.
It is a little bit warm today, I'm not going to lie.
And we're also really privileged to have Lucy here in person. So we've got Dr Lucy Richardson, who's the Laboratory and Quality Director from Herts and Essex Fertility Centre. We brought you out to Mexico City.
I know.
It's lovely to spend some more time with you.
You're out the lab. Does that ever happen?
This is very strange. I'll take it though.
Yeah, do it.
So Lucy, just tell us a little bit about what you do. What's your role at Herts and Essex?
So at Herts and Essex, I am primarily an embryologist, but I am the Laboratory and Quality Director. So I am hands-on in the lab, but I am in charge of the lab, of the procedures, of the staff, ensuring that our patients will get top quality treatment. And in addition to that, I do oversee the quality side of the organisation as well. So lots
serious role.
So
very serious role.
That's why it's really important to have you on this podcast today, because anything to do with export obviously involves the lab, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you would oversee all of the process, and we are going to talk about what is involved in that process in this podcast today. But you would ultimately be responsible for ensuring that all of that process is followed, right?
I mean, ultimately, I'm there to protect the embryos and the gametes, and it's my job to ensure that if we are transferring out to or receiving in from an external clinic, that their safety is put first all the time.
Amazing. And Debbie, I know we've introduced you, but why don't you just give the listener or the people watching a little bit of an overview of your role at My Surrogacy Journey and what part you play in embryo export?
Okay, so my role within clinical and compliance, a new addition to my title earlier this year, for my sins, ensures that when I'm meeting with you as the intended parents, that I can navigate through where your embryos are, whose gametes have been used, and what are the requirements that will meet the HFEA Code of Practice. And the HFEA is our Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, and it governs fertility in the UK. So it's very important that we meet all of the requirements so that we can safely export your embryos or gametes outside.
And that might sound a bit intimidating, right? There's a lot involved. And let's put this into context. We're very lucky in the UK that we do have this regulatory authority that governs it and makes sure that everything is done safely. But there are a lot of elements that need to be considered when exporting embryos to make sure that they comply with general direction. And I know we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail, but just to put it into context, it can seem overwhelming, but that's why we have professionals and we work with partners that have the relevant expertise to make sure that we're doing everything that meets the compliance of the regulator, because if we don't, we can't export, right?
Absolutely.
And it's about that. That's why we have set this up in a way to really support you in managing on your behalf that whole embryo export process, because I think, you know, the listener or people watching will see from this podcast, it's really complex.
It really is. And there are so many people that do this on their own. The constant thing that we hear is, oh my Lord, what a minefield. You know, how do I even know where I can export my embryos and what testing and screening? And we're going to cover all of that today, which is going to be really good.
And I think sometimes what happens is that, and this is why we do it in the way we do, is that often if you're doing it on your own, you might get to the point where you think you're ready to export, and then you realise that your screening hasn't been completed, and then that's going to take further and further delays. So, you know, part of the process we go through with, well, I say we, the royal we, Debbie, goes through with the intended parents, and then in collaboration with the exporting clinic. So in this scenario, you say Herts and Essex, is make sure that everything has been considered, everything meets requirements, so that when we are ready to export, there should be no delays.
No, and that's correct, and it gives you reassurance as the listeners that when you do come through MSJ, that we know we've got your back, and that we will make sure that you will be compliant in order to export your embryo safety. Just a little fun fact, I think between Lucy and I, we've got over 50 years experience within the fertility sector.
5 zeros.
5 zeros. So you're in safe hands.
In safe
the pair of
hands.
us.
And Lucy has a wonderful
unofficial title.
Tell
us all about it.
Tell us what it is.
I am the sperm queen.
So there's the self-proclaimed sperm queen. We love that.
We love that. Your title. That is, Lucy, the title, just to be very clear.
So let's not get too distracted about
come on, we've got lots to go through.
Now, just before we jump into the kind of the topics, Lucy, in your introduction, you mentioned the word gametes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, would you mind just giving us a bit of an explanation on that? Because I think it's a technical term and it's one that's used in the industry, but I think sometimes intended parents might not know what that means, and it is very commonly used, isn't it? So would you mind just giving us a bit of an update on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So essentially, gametes are either the sperm or the eggs. And then when they are combined together and create an egg that is fertilised, it then becomes an embryo. So when we're looking at exporting, we could be looking at exporting either eggs, sperm, or embryos. But gametes collectively refers to sperm and eggs.
Okay, so if we're just shipping an embryo, we would call it an embryo.
Yes.
If we're just shipping an eggs or a sperm, we would call it gametes as the collective.
Yeah.
Amazing. See, you learn
There we
something
go. Another little nugget there. Shall we? Right.
Yeah. Go on, Michael.
Go on. I know. I was poised, ready there, Wes. So let's talk about how this even begins. So let's look at shipping and how we transport these gametes. Because again, when we're talking to people, one of the common either misconceptions or things that people don't understand is, how do they get there?
How do they get from A to B?
A to B.
Now we know there's a process before A and after B.
Yeah.
But what is that process for A to B?
What is that transport process?
Yeah.
So when we're looking at transporting either egg, sperm or embryos, we look to use a reputable courier. So a courier is essentially somebody that specialises in the movement of biological samples, so in our case sperm, eggs or embryos. In the lab with me, the embryos that are frozen, or the eggs and sperm that are frozen, are obviously kept safe and nice and cold in liquid nitrogen. Liquid nitrogen is quite a hazardous substance. It can actually be fatal. So in order to move those samples safely and maintain those cold temperatures, which keeps the cells themselves safe, they have to be moved within a specialised vessel, which we call a transport dewar. And that vessel is prepared so that it is kept at minus 193. So
oh my God, is that I didn't really realise that. I knew that it was like very cold, but minus 193. My God.
So the actual vessel itself will have an external temperature probe that will monitor to make sure that those levels keep cold, to keep those samples safe. There'll be an alarm on it. So if there is any deviation, then it's going to alert that there is potentially an issue with that vessel, and the vessel itself is securely locked as well.
So, Lucy, with the dewars, what are the various types or options that can be had when you're transporting?
So when we're looking at an international transport, there are broadly two different ways in which they can go. The first would be a sort of a hand carry-on, as if the courier is actually taking it onto the plane as hand luggage, per se, or it could go in the hold. Now, my preference will always be, for safety perspective, to have it as a hand carry-on, so that you know that you've got your designated courier that is with your sample throughout the whole journey, and also safeguarding that dewar. So the dewar, it looks a bit like a Dalek. And potentially it could roll on its side, potentially it could get knocked, which could disturb the environment of the liquid, of the nitrogen within the actual dewar. So it's like a vacuum flask, and if you imagine if you had your flask of coffee and you end up with a dent in it, it can affect how it functions. So by having that person with that dewar the whole time, it's an additional safety step, and that would always be my recommendation.
Okay. And is there anything else, Lucy, that people should be mindful of when you're considering hand carry or export? What else should we be aware of?
So the dewar containing the eggs and the sperm and the embryos cannot go through X-ray. So on the outside of the dewar, we will always affix a large sign that says "Care, tissues and cells contained within do not X-ray." Because passing it through an X-ray machine would be very damaging to them. And again, having hand carry, you've then safeguarded that, because that person is with that, and exactly.
You know that's not going to go through an X-ray machine or anything like that.
And we only work with couriers that do hand carry.
Yeah, we do.
And that is really important for us, because it is like, I mean, for some people, particularly those oncology patients, that are people who don't have the ability to create more embryos, and these are all they have, and we are shipping them. They are really precious.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure we safeguard it. And I know from some of the couriers that we use is that, when it's on an aircraft, it doesn't go in the overhead bin, it goes in between their legs so that it's maintained upright, and they take care of it. And I think it is about having that additional layer of confidence that someone is there to navigate it and get it from A to B.
Yeah, and in addition, that courier company that's selected must have, according to UK law at least, a written agreement with both the receiving and the sending clinic. So we, as a sending clinic, need to be reassured that we have a contract of what standards they will adhere to, and they have been written and signed and agreed, so I can safely be reassured that once the samples have left my unit, the safety standards that I would expect are adhered to.
Brilliant.
And it's not just about, is it you, once they've gone, you're really concerned with making sure that where they're going to, it meets all of the criteria.
Absolutely.
And that's one of your elements, isn't
it? It is a lengthy and tough process, but that's for the safety. That's to make sure that we are upholding all of our regulatory requirements, which ultimately is to protect our future parents.
Yeah, absolutely.
Debbie, one of the things that is often really asked early on with intended parents are what are the things that need to be in place to be able to export? So from an IP point of view, and we can come on to that from a clinic point of view, but from an IP point of view, Debbie, what are the types of things that need to be in place to enable everything to move forward to prepare the shipment?
So I think what is really important to take on board is that quite often your embryos have been created for your own use, and they were never created for the intention of surrogacy.
For our hetero members.
Yeah, for our heterosexual couples. And we need to be really mindful of that. We need to understand, is it your own gametes that have been used to create these embryos, or was a donor involved, either egg or sperm? So that's my job, to understand that, and that's my job to make sure that we meet the HFA requirements. So in order to export out of the UK to any other country, or just literally outside, we have to be compliant with the HFEA requirements. And those requirements say that you will now be treated as a donor. And so you would need to be screened as a donor would be in the UK. And if you created your gametes to an embryo for your own use, you would never have been screened as a donor. So I have to look at the clinic that you were at, have a look at the screening that was carried out at the time of the creation of the embryos, and work out what is needed retrospectively, because you will not be able to ship those embryos without the correct screening in place. And because it's being done retrospectively, it's our job also at MSJ to make sure that the surrogate that's going to be taking those embryos is fully made aware that this is retrospective screening. The other bit that we need to be really mindful of is the consent. So our HFEA, as Lucy's alluded to very nicely, is there for a reason, to protect all of us, but most importantly to protect those gametes and embryos. And so we need consent from each gamete provider. And as Lucy said, the gametes are the eggs and the sperm. And so if you used a donor, either an egg or a sperm donor, we would need consent from that donor in order to ship your embryos. Now, the current consent forms that may well have been signed at the time do not have any place within that consent that allows your gametes to be exported outside of the UK. So again, that's something retrospectively we would need to go back to your clinic with your support, and the clinic then needs to make contact with the donor. Now, of course, in most cases, these donors would have been anonymous, and so the clinic then is duty-bound to contact the donor on your behalf and seek consent. And that consent is a simple consent that your clinic will put together to say, yes, I'm happy for my egg or my sperm that was used to create your embryos to be exported to Mexico City. We need to state where they're going to. And in order to do all of that, we then need to supply the clinic that's intending to export all of the relevant information regarding the clinic in Mexico City. And MSJ will support all of that so that we try and take a lot of the onerous elements around seeking all of that information to the clinic. So we will support you with that. We'll give you that information that allows you then to export those embryos.
I'm just, my mind's blown already, just the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes with what we do and what the clinic will be doing to make sure this is ready to export. There's a hell of a lot of work to be done.
There's so much work to do, and I think people underestimate the what goes into preparing for shipping. And ultimately, we're creating an environment to help them be successful, to help it be as minimal from a time frame point of view, and to make sure that everything's considered so we ultimately can export. That I think is one of the things that people think it's easy. It's not.
You have to give time.
You do, but also, Debbie, remember, everything we've just talked about up until this point is just about the process from the UK point of view. There's then another quite arduous process from a Mexico point of view, which we deal with as well. And Mexico is complex from an import permit point of view, and the process which is called COFEPRIS, which is the government department within there, that processes that. You know, there's always two parts. There's the sending part and there's the receiving part, and all of this needs to be considered. Debbie, can I just pick up on one of the points that you mentioned? Changing in status to becoming a donor. Why is that? Because some people might not understand that. So just give us a quick...
How many times do I have intended parents ask me, why I'm not a donor? Why am I,
if they've both used their own gametes,
correct.
Right?
But you do, within the guidance of the HFEA, it's not in every country, but certainly for the HFEA, you are now deemed as a donor because you are donating your gametes and you are asking a surrogate to carry those embryos for you. That means you then become a donor. So you need to meet all of that. That includes the implications counselling, the consenting and the screening, all really important. It's just one thing that I want to just pick up with you all. If you have used a donor gamete and you do reach out to that gamete provider, egg or sperm, you need to also be aware that there is a possibility that the donor could withdraw consent.
Good point.
And that's really important to remember. And as much as that's horrific and it's really hard to take on board, within the HFEA, the guidance is that the donor donates the gamete, but until that gamete is transferred as an embryo transfer, the donor can withdraw consent right up to that point. So if the donor is not happy to give consent to export outside of the UK, then that is their right to do so. And unfortunately, there is nothing within the realms of the HFEA that we could, certainly as MSJ, that we could override or get your embryos out in any other way.
And we're working hard now with a lot of the clinics in the UK to raise awareness on this, to hopefully try and get consent at the point of creation, which is difficult because, like, this affects us, Michael, right? You know, so we created embryos in the UK with no intention at the time with thinking that we'd ever need to export them. And it's very specific, the requirements, isn't it, for consent, that one, they have to consent to allow for the export to happen, but you also need to be very specific about the country that they're being exported to, and they need to be made aware of the law that governs it in those countries.
Yeah.
So often, particularly with heterosexual couples who are creating them, but also for us, that was never a consideration when you were creating those embryos.
No.
And dynamics change and journeys change, and this is some of the fallout that we're dealing with now, isn't it? For a lot of our intended parents.
And this is something that we discovered in the process of doing what we're now doing, creating this shipping service for our members, is we unearthed issues with consent, and we're now living through this and having to create relevant consents for clinics and intended parents to make sure we do this properly.
And just when we'll talk again about consents, but as the intended parents, when this is the pathway that you're now choosing, talk to your clinic also, get the information from us, we'll support you in all of that, and your support, speaking with your clinic where you created your embryos, is also really key, so that they understand that you are now looking for a surrogacy journey outside of the UK, and you will be made aware that you've got screening missing, consents missing. Your clinic may often not know that. There's we talked about Direction 6. It's very clearly, it's in our code of practice, but I can guarantee that most clinics do not have full awareness that each gamete provider must give consent to export, because it's not on the general HFEA consent forms. You have to create a new in-house clinic consent that covers that.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, Debbie, because I think, so certainly for myself and my clinic, we're performing a lot of surrogacy. And whilst it is a more complex level of treatment, once you have that service established, it becomes a much simpler and easier process. But not every clinic is well versed in surrogacy, and they may not understand the requirements, not only from a treatment in the UK perspective, but then you add a level of complexity of export for the use of surrogacy overseas. Not every clinic is necessarily set up with that understanding.
And that's why we wanted to create a clinic that was in the south of England for export, being Herts and Essex, and then creating one in the north and having that within Manchester. It was important that we worked with an experienced team that knew the process from end to end.
And there are very few clinics in the UK that actually have this expertise. Herts and Essex is one of them.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people are working with clinics that don't have this expertise and struggle to understand what information they need to provide and what role they need to do.
Yeah.
And that's where we come in, because we will, once you give us to consent to deal with your clinic on your behalf, we will support you and that clinic to enable the process to happen. Now, we're doing that already, and some clinics are more challenging than others. And I think, but generally, there's very little export that happens in the UK, generally. There's not a lot. And what we're finding is that because this pathway's been so successful, more and more people are looking to export, but the kind of the framework isn't there to do that. So we're building it, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about that towards the latter part of this podcast. But we are seeing that, aren't we, Debbie? They're just not equipped to deal with it.
No, and even from a surrogacy agency perspective, other agencies may not have clinical personnel within the agency. Yeah. So we're well versed in the fact that you've got my experience to be able to converse with the clinic directly and understand and know the complexities around the requirements that need to be in place. And so I can directly say, this is what is needed, X, Y, and Z, and this needs to be done now.
Really important.
It is.
So they understand fully.
And we also work in close, we also work really close with the HFEA. Correct. Because every case is very different, and there are some things that don't fall within what's called general direction. There are some things that fall outside of that. And remember, everyone's case is very specific. Everyone's very individual to them, so we have to look at it. But this is, we have a concierge service. That's what we do, and it's working with our really trusted partners like Herts and Essex and your team that allow us to make sure we're doing everything in our power to be able to effectively export those embryos so that people can start their journey.
Yeah. It's our job to make sure that all of those requirements are met, because if they're not, and you get to a point of needing to export and something hasn't been put in place, then those embryos don't get exported and your treatment's put on hold, and then all the anxiety and the upset that can cause. So it's our job, as you say, we're a concierge, to make sure that all of that's in place at the right time in order for Lucy and likes of Herts and Essex to be able to export really swiftly and easily.
Yep. So,
Go on, Wes.
do you go?
No, you go.
So,
Risks.
yes.
We've kind of done the other one, haven't we?
Yeah. So people, like, we've talked about how precious some of these, like, this material is for some people. I mean, it's precious for everyone, but for some more than others,
Yeah.
right? Has bigger impact. What do we think the risks are, Lucy, in terms of to people? Because I know that's a question I get asked quite a lot. You know, what are the risks? Sometimes people have never had to think about shipping before,
Yeah.
so that it's something really new to them. And
I mean, to reassure, shipping of samples, domestically particularly, is very, very common. We receive samples in from other clinics in the UK on a very, very regular basis. So that in itself, it is a safe process, but nothing in fertility treatment is without risk. Obviously, there could potentially be, a catastrophic loss of embryos. In all the years, touch wood, I've been doing this over 20 years. I've never seen, but
there's a potential. Right?
Yeah.
Potential.
Yeah, and I think to minimise that risk, it's about working with reputable shippers. It's about
having those safety mechanisms in place.
It's about putting all of those elements in place, which is going to maximise success. And I talk about this a lot with this journey, is how do you put all of those processes in place to maximise success? And it's about working with an organisation that's experienced in these and works with the partners that have the expertise and the skill to be able to do it. And we make sure that we get all of the information ahead so that we can be successful.
I've been asked by IPs, why can't I carry them myself?
Yeah, I've seen people say that as well. Yeah.
So why can't they, Lucy?
Well, I mean, I can remember a time when, many, many years ago, patients could do that. I mean, obviously... Domestically.
Yeah.
But you could be provided with a dewar from a clinic, pop the samples in. We tell you, okay, put it in the car, put it on the footwell, open your windows, because if any liquid nitrogen, or if any nitrogen vapour comes out, I mean, it's potentially fatal.
Oh my God.
Off you go. Safe journey.
Brilliant. Enjoy.
Can we have our shipper back when you're finished?
And I've known people do that. Particularly from one London clinic to another.
Yeah, they've walked over the bridge when it's gone from one London clinic to another.
Yeah.
I remember, I know someone that's done that.
You can't get on a plane with your own shipper.
No. As much as we probably would want to guard those precious little embryos. So, from the HFEA, we spoke about quite a bit, which is obviously our UK fertility regulator. What are the regulations on shipping?
So, in terms of the actual export, so from an HFEA perspective, there's something called the General Directions. That gives us quite a lengthy and comprehensive list of standards that the clinic that's receiving must adhere to. So we need copies of their documentation, copies of their quality records, copies of their certification. We need assurances that the embryos or eggs or sperm are being exported for the provision of medical services or storage for future treatment. And we need to have all of that documented. So there's quite a lot of work that needs to go on in the background before we're in a position to say, okay, I have sufficient evidence to say that I can satisfy this general direction and we can release those.
How long will that take?
It does massively vary on the clinic that you're sending to.
And obviously how much they play ball. And
exactly.
And what they understand,
Language barriers, time differences. There's lots of other levels of complexity when you're moving internationally. But as I say, if you're working with a reputable clinic who's working with a reputable courier and you're sending to a reputable clinic, it's much more straightforward.
Yeah. Good.
And I think we are going to talk about it a little bit later, but I think one of the reasons we want to get this infrastructure in place is so that all of those things are done once. We kind of sign that I say the royal we, you sign that clinic off to make sure that you know that they meet all of the requirements of general direction. And then when things come through, all of that's being done and we should
much
be able to move it through. And I think that's why, as an organisation, we've looked at the needs of shipment and people's gametes needed to be moved, particularly to Mexico City. And now we're trying to build an infrastructure and put it in place that makes that as efficient, as smooth as possible. Now, we know that it's been hard to get to this point, and we've still got some hurdles to get over, and we've got a lot of people waiting for embryos to be moved. But once we get this in place, that's going to be a much smoother process to enable this to happen, and it should happen much sooner. I'm really looking forward to working with building that, because I think it's a really it's a part of the journey that intended parents are really anxious about.
So anxious,
but rightly so, though,
Absolutely,
right? You know what I mean?
absolutely.
I know we're in this position, Wes, and
We are.
it's something that who would have known it would taken us this long for us to get where we need to, and we still have issues with consents.
Yeah.
So we're still not out of the woods either.
No, and I think one thing that we might want to highlight so that people understand is that, you know, it's fine getting all that stuff in place at Herts and Essex ready to export it, but if they haven't had their embryos created at Herts and Essex, we've got to move them to Herts and Essex.
Yeah.
So then there's got to be a process of getting that lab, making sure that, I mean, you might not have a third-party agreement with them, or you might not have the process in place, so that has to happen. Now, is that as a lengthy a process as the export?
No, I mean, moving domestically is much more straightforward. Although we still have the standards that we have to adhere to, and there is still the requirement for the exchange of documentation, the blood test results, consents. It's much more streamlined, and as I say, it's quite common.
Because you work with the same regulator as well,
Exactly,
so everyone will be a
we're
bit
under
more...
the same framework.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that we need to have the particular screening for, HIV, Hep B, Hep C. We all know that they need to be dated within the same time frame. We all know that if you've had a certain type of treatment, these are the consent forms that you must have in place. So from that perspective, it's more straightforward, because we're all playing from the same hymn sheet, or singing from the same hymn sheet.
But it's definitely another thing that people need to consider, right?
Totally. You can see why this is quite a challenging time for everyone, especially if you're trying to piece all this together on your own.
Yeah, sure. And we've talked about the UK element, and to get embryos or gametes out of the UK. But let's quickly talk about the kind of the import process in Mexico. Now, none of us are experts in this. We just know that it's quite a challenging process, and
a relatively new process.
It's a relatively new process, and we have to essentially, what we're looking to do with the receiving clinic, so another one of our partners, which is Talulah and Duke, is that we are looking to get a permit which they apply for the Mexican authorities, and they will need to demonstrate the information that you have to make sure that you meet all the requirements, and they have to submit that as part of the permit application. Now, you can request a specific permit for one shipment, or you can have a 6-month permit which has limits on the number of gametes and embryos that can move through that. So that's what we're looking to get in place. We don't really see the point of having to go through this process for every single shipment, because it's just going to be so arduous, and to get all of that in place. And what they don't do is give you a time frame of how long it's going to take to get that, which is always a challenge, because we know, and Debbie, you deal with this probably quite frequently, is like intended parents like, what's the update? What's the update? What's the update? So I think, there is a specific permit process we are working through, and that's exactly why Lucy's here in Mexico City to work with Talulah and Duke and the team there to start that process of getting that permit in place. But I think it's just putting it into perspective that it's never just one process. There's a process in the UK, there's a process in Mexico.
And I think it's probably worthwhile for the listener or the viewer that as of today, this is March 2024. So if you are listening to this much later on in the year, for example, and this process may already been done, signed off, and we're all motoring ahead.
We'll have to bring you back to do an update.
There we go.
Yes, please.
Right, so we've looked at the import process, and one of the elements that I love to geek out about is how we freeze these gametes, and what are the techniques, and are these techniques universally and globally the same?
And also, why are we talking about this on this podcast? Because, and I think people just assume that it's there's one thawing and one freezing process.
I know, I did.
But and that's why we want to talk about it, because there's a very specific process and there's a very specific impact, isn't there? Lucy, maybe give us a bit of an insight to that.
The sort of the historical way that we used to freeze embryos was something called slow freezing. It has a very specific protocol. When you slow freeze an embryo, you have to slow thaw it. So that you have to match the freezing and the thawing with the technique that was initially used. Now, there are still embryos out there that were created using slow freezing, but certainly at Herts and Essex from at least 2012, we moved to something called vitrification, which is a fast freezing technique. It gives much better survival rates. It gives much better success rates overall. But if you have embryos that have been frozen using the vitrification method, you can't thaw them out using the slow thaw method. You have to marry those two techniques. So that's something that's really important.
So interesting.
We need to know how those embryos were frozen. Was it through vitrification? Was it through slow freezing? Because we then need to make sure that we have the necessary equipment and the necessary media and consumables in the laboratory to thaw those out safely for you.
That's why it's really important to have an embryo creation report from the clinic where your embryos were created.
Yeah,
of course, because you'll know how they were done.
Lucy, it will give you the exact information you need.
And whilst there are some redundancy between commercially available vitrification media, not all of them can be used for the same. So if you have a very specific media that's been used to freeze embryos, you need to make sure that potentially you have the same matching kit to thaw them. And you may not have that. That may not be a process that a protocol that you have already in the laboratory. So we need to make sure all of those things are marry up.
Yeah, but and I'm really glad you kind of give us an explanation of that, Lucy, because I think people really don't understand. And why would they? Because
no, exactly.
They're not,
that's why you pay the clinic to do what they need to do.
It is, but I really wanted to help people understand the process and the detail that we have to go into to safeguard people's exports and make sure that when they do get to the place they're going to, they're going to be safe and can be thawed in a way that's going to be conducive of moving forward and being successful.
Absolutely.
And go on, Deb.
And it's not just about having that right media in the lab, it's about having the expertise
and the right skill set
to use that.
Because you may not have been trained how to.
No, I mean, we haven't slow frozen in years and years and years. So some of the newer embryologists will have never have had to use that particular technique. So you need to make sure that the right expertise is receiving your embryos as well.
And imagine that you got embryos exported to a clinic and they didn't have the facilities to be able to thaw them. And that's just
that's Lucy's job to make sure when she's exporting that clinic has
got the right media.
It is, but if you go through an organisation like us to be able to support it, we make sure this is just kind of showing all of the steps and all of the processes that go through.
Important.
A career's not going to be interested on whether that
the media they use and all of that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
It's just a geek question. How long does it take to thaw out an embryo?
If you're using the vitrification thawing, it's really quite quick. So you move, you've got your embryos that are in the liquid nitrogen, very, very cold temperature. And what vitrification is a fast freeze or a fast thaw technique. So you immediately bring the embryos into a media that's at 37 degrees. So you're going from minus 193 to 37 degrees within seconds.
Wow.
The timing of that
Does it not shock them? It shocked me.
Jesus. Wake up. But the timing is critical and the technique is critical. So once you've done that, you then move the embryos through a series of solutions at room temperature. Probably all in all, it takes about 15 minutes to do, but you then need to give the embryo time to recover. So once you've done that thawing process, the embryos go back into the incubator so that they can recover from what potentially is a very stressful procedure. When we're freezing embryos, what we do is remove all the water from the cells and replace it with something called a cryoprotectant, which essentially keeps the cells safe in the really cold temperatures where they're stored. And what happens is the embryo collapses or shrinks. When we're thawing, we're doing the reverse. So we're removing that cryoprotectant, adding water back in.
Oh, I love this sort of stuff.
And then it causes the embryo to re-expand. So when we put our embryos back into the incubator, a couple of hours later when we check them, we're looking for the re-expansion of that embryo to show that it has recovered. And we can then assess for the survival of the two key structures that are necessary for the embryo to give rise to a pregnancy. So that's the inner cell mass, the cells that give rise to the fetus, and then the trophectoderm, which are the cells that give rise to the placenta.
I'm glad I asked this question.
That is making the assumption that it is a blastocyst that's been frozen, so that's an embryo on day 5 of its development. But to be honest, the majority of embryos are now frozen at the day 5 stage. But that's not to say we can't work with embryos that were frozen either at day 2, day 3 of development, or indeed day 6 or 7.
So, Debbie, I know we were asked recently a question from a set of intended parents about whether we would export aneuploid embryos.
Yeah, so, but there's particular types. So if they're not, Lucy will tell you much, much more. She's much more well-versed to do this. But if they have a mosaicism, so if they're low mosaic, so they haven't got the full mosaic complement, then you could potentially use that if you had no other choice. So if all of your other embryos were aneuploid and all you had was low mosaic, then there's potential. But you need to counsel those patients because you've got higher risk of miscarriage, higher risk of failure to implant, higher risk of other conditions moving forward. So you need to really counsel the patients. It's not to say that we won't, and we would be really counselling those patients.
Aneuploid would mean a non-normal embryo, correct?
So Lucy will tell you that,
So what we're talking about here is testing embryos. Removing some cells through through biopsy, testing those cells, and what we're looking for, as Debbie said, broadly there are actually 4 main things we'll see. The first is the ideal, is that the embryo is chromosomally normal, which is euploid. Aneuploid is the opposite end of the spectrum, which means it's chromosomally abnormal. And then there is mosaicism, which means there's a mixture of normal cells and abnormal cells. You can either have an embryo that is a low-level mosaic, which means more cells are normal than abnormal, or a high-level mosaic. So more abnormal cells than normal cells. So obviously, in an ideal scenario, we're looking at transferring the euploid or the normal embryo. But you can go on and transfer embryos that are mosaic.
And have a live birth.
And actually one thing that goes round and round in my head with the genetic testing, so somebody who has Down syndrome would have been an aneuploid embryo.
Okay.
Down syndrome, it's not conducive to life. My next door neighbour has Down syndrome. He's a Paralympian.
Wow.
He has done more in his life than I could even have dreamt of. But he was an aneuploid embryo. So
it's put it into context, isn't it?
Totally.
And one of the reasons I asked is because I know we've got a set of intended parents who are looking to ship, and the question is, would they ship them as well, and would the clinic or the doctor
receive them
and transfer them? And that's, I think...
And we're aligned, so when I spoke with Dr Gutierrez and asked him the exact question, because I need to make sure that the clinic that those embryos are being transferred to will support that, because this couple had 1 euploid embryo and 3 low mosaics. And so, they wanted to know, they didn't want to just transfer that one. That's
of course
hedging a lot of bets on that one embryo. And so their backup was the low mosaicism. So they need to know that the clinic are happy to do so, because I'm not sure, are there any clinics that would not transfer a low mosaic?
Not to my knowledge.
I don't think so, but as long as you counsel the patients and they understand the risk elements associated with that.
Cool, okay. So let's talk about if you did create embryos outside of the UK. We didn't ship them. I know this is specific shipping, but it is relevant. Would we be able to ship those embryos back into...
Export them, you mean?
Import them back into the UK?
Yeah.
Import them.
So in order to import, we need the clinic that's receiving, so the UK clinic, needs to apply to the HFEA for a specific importing tissue establishment certificate. So although we can export without the need for that certificate, provided we have sufficient evidence of the standards that the clinic adheres to, in order for us to bring into the UK, we have to apply for this specific licence, and that has to be granted by the HFEA. So similarly to what you were discussing with the Mexico licence, you can either have a one-off or you can have a multiple or a bulk. So, for example, if you needed donor sperm, we hold importing tissue establishment licences with various overseas donor banks, so we can just bring in on that licence. But if you had an embryo that was frozen in a specific clinic, we would then need to apply to the HFEA to have a licence granted in order to bring that embryo in. Again, lots of documentation, lots of record keeping and checks, but theoretically should be straightforward, but not always guaranteed.
Yeah. And the reason I ask is because if you did export your embryos, you had a live birth, and you had embryos left, do you have the ability to bring them back if you chose to do that?
I mean, certainly if they were UK created, I think it would be a much...
That's what I was about to ask.
You'd still need to have the ITE in place, but I think it'd be much, much more straightforward.
And obviously making sure that if you did use a donor overseas, for example, it's making sure that doesn't breach any compensation.
Yeah.
Or, if you've moved those embryos out, so you created them in the UK, moved them out, then had them sex selected and tested, then they're no longer compliant to the HFEA.
Bring them in then.
That is interesting, because as we know, that happens extensively in the US and certainly in Mexico City.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think what this has really demonstrated is that there are lots of complex elements, there are lots of moving parts, and there's lots of considerations that intended parents need to think about. And I think this, if anything, the listener or people watching would recognise that the need for support during this process, the need for, and I think, why do we work with partner clinics? Because we have a great relationship, and we can be more effective on behalf of the intended parents. You know, working with a clinic that we don't have that relationship is always going to be harder. That it's always going to be longer, and it's always going to be more complex.
Really is. It really is.
One of the things that people really struggle to get their head around throughout this whole export process is how long it takes. And what's the time frame? Because, and I think the difficult part for all of us when we are trying to have those conversations with intended parents is we don't know.
And without being flippant, you know, how long is a piece of string? And I really mean that in that sort of context, because it depends on the clinic you're at, what screening was in place, what consents were in place, how they were frozen,
the experience.
Have you got an embryo creation report? You know, were donor gametes involved? There's so much to look at, but that's why we're here to support you in that part of the journey. That's why I'm here, in order to converse with that clinic and ask those specific questions on your behalf. And then as soon as we've got all of that in place, then we're happy to speak with Lucy and the team at Herts and Essex and say, right, we're ready to export to you, and then in readiness for exporting outside of the UK.
It is, and I think, you know, our utopia is when we have the permits in place with Lucy and Herts and Essex, and potentially some other clinics further down the line. But our whole process is set up to enable that smooth process, isn't it? To get to the point of export. All of the stuff that you do with our IPs is to get ready for the point that they go to Lucy. So I know sometimes people get frustrated, well, why are you asking for this? Why are you asking for that? But it's about having everything in place and not getting to the point of where we think we're ready to export them, but we haven't done this. Then that's going to delay it because like we talked about retrospective screening, some of those tests can take up to 4-5 weeks to come back, can't they?
If you haven't had the general karyotyping or cystic fibrosis, they take 4 weeks.
So it's about understanding all of these things.
And being efficient with when you do it.
I'll always tell you, when I'm having that first conversation with you as a set of intended parents looking to export, then I will start those I've had IPs say to me, they're not very comfortable going back to the clinic where they've created their embryos. Their relationship has broken down. But unfortunately, they have to go back to that clinic because that's where your embryos were created. And I'll support you with that. I'll help you navigate through what needs to be
and have some of those difficult conversations.
But we are, as a team, we're very transparent and we're very clear from the beginning. You know, we don't know how long this is going to take for you. You need to bear with us. Trust us that we are putting everything in place to make it the most safe, efficient and correct process to get your embryos where you want them to get.
And I think if any team's going to be able to do this, it's ours. You know, it's what we've learned. It's the experience that we've got. You know,
the people that we work with.
Totally.
You know, the relationships we have.
Your embryos are in the best possible place when it comes to looking at how we can get these exported.
Look, I think this has been such a powerful and really informative...
A meaty episode. It's longer than what I thought this was going to be, but this was really interesting.
It is, but I think I'm hoping that someone watching or listening to this podcast really goes away with a better sense of all of the components
and
involved.
what actually takes place.
And what actually takes place to get them to be able to move their embryos. And I think for me, a particular, and Michael's going to kill me because he's going to say that I stole his thingy, but the takeaway, the best bit for me was understanding the freezing and the thawing process and thinking that. What about you, Michael?
No, you've ruined it for me, I'm afraid. I knew you were going to steal my thunder.
You love the science, don't you?
I love the science, and you know, I adore the work that Dr. Richardson does, and I not only love talking to her about sperm, but love just the science behind why you and your colleagues are so amazing. You know, that whole process is just, it's the why we've got our gorgeous babies today. So I just love hearing about how they were created and how they were frozen and thawed. It's just fab.
It's very special.
It's so special.
Very special.
So I really appreciate you telling me a bit more about that.
Pleasure.
So we hope you enjoyed today's episode and it answered the questions that you had. I know I was geeking out already to all the stuff that Wes just said. So what did you enjoy? Anything else, Wes, do you want to pick out? Or what you listening? What is it for you that you took from that was comforting or enjoyable, let us know.
I think from a Debbie point of view, it's like understanding why we do what we do at the beginning, and I'm hoping if any of the takeaway comes from this for the listener or the watcher is that it's about being prepared and getting all of your ducks in a row, if you like, and getting all of those.
There's a lot of ducks.
There is.
So massive thanks to Debbie and to the wonderful Dr. Lucy Richardson. So thank you very, very much for being here in Mexico. Do you know what I mean? Like, thank you for,
Tough job.
I know, tough gig this was, but thank you both for being here.
A pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Don't forget, there's another episode available, whether you're listening via our app or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google or YouTube. There's still time to get another fix.
So if you want more information about our services or our pathway, or whether it's anything else, head over to mysurrogacyjourney.com. We'd love to help you and figure out the best way to build your family.
We've loved having you back today, so don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and feel free to leave a review too if it's been helpful, of course. Until next time, hasta luego.
Bye.
Bye.